we are so happy to have Professor Elizabeth Merrill with us here today from Ghent University. Elizabeth is an expert in early modern architectural drawings of Italy and has published a great deal on everything from professional practice to notebooks, which is how I first learned about your incredible work, and thinking in new ways and new dimensions about the role of the drawing in the early modern period. Today, she's with us to talk about Is Everything a Copy? Rethinking the Ingenuity of 15th century machine drawing. So welcome, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and for the invitation to present. What I'm going to present is part of this larger ERC-funded research project that looks at Francesco Di Giorgio's Opusculum de Architectura and its legacy. And so I'm going to kind of introduce that briefly, but then go into kind of more some specific material. So I will just jump in with that. Try to get this right. Let's click here. The story of Francesco Di Giorgio's Opusculum de Architectura, like that of its maker, is the subject of myth. The extraordinary talents of the Sienese architect were already recounted by his contemporaries. According to Giovanni Santi, who was in close contact with Francesco in the 1470s and 1480s in Urbino, the architect's resounding fame, quote, coursed about like a cloud soaring through the skies. As given by Santi, he was an admirable architect, the best of project planners, gifted in the conception of arcane machines, and unmatched in his invention of war engines. Quote, what seemed impossible for others to achieve came so naturally to him that I was truly filled with wonder. End quote. Giorgio Vasari, Life of Francesco Di Giorgio, muddles some basic biographical details, but is clear about the impact of this most excellent sculptor and architect, to whom, quote, much gratitude is due for his having facilitated the art of architecture and for his having rendered to it greater services than any other man has done from the time of Sir Filippo Brunelleschi to his own, end quote. This image of the architect is reinforced, and one might even say deliberately propagated, in Francesco Di Giorgio's Opusculum. Conserved today in the British Museum, the compact vellum manuscript is composed of 84 folios. Its drawings, 195 unique mechanical designs, celebrate the art and ingenuity of technical design. The subjects range from tools and building equipment, to artillery and defense works, to fountains and hydraulic systems, to overtly referential figural drawings and labyrinthine building plans. Turning the pages, the reader is continually surprised, if not slightly overwhelmed, by the many innovative designs and ideas. Adhering to the graphic principle of one machine, one drawing, each opusculum drawing conveys the essential components of a given device, yet almost categorically without annotation. The only substantial text in the opusculum is that of its eloquent Latin dedication. Addressed to Federico da Montefeltro, the text explicitly likens the patron to the great rulers of history, declaring him an example of true antiquity and implicitly placing Francesco Di Giorgio alongside antiquity's favored architects. The little book, Opusculum, of architecture contains, quote, many things worth remembering and unknown to others, end quote, what Francesco claims he has himself invented. With unvarnished self-promotion, Francesco asserts that, quote, not all aspects dealt with in the manuscript could have been represented by drawing. Indeed, many concepts are better explained by the architect's intellect and intuition than by pictures and plans, end quote. There's a sense that the opusculum's models are only apprehended with the guidance of the singularly gifted, experienced architect. This exalted status of the architect perfectly aligns with the mythology of the Urbino court and the presumed provenance of the opusculum in the fabled library of the Palazzo Ducale. We are left to imagine the noble manuscript shelved among the library's treasured volumes, which could be readily consulted by the Duke with the architect at his shoulder. In this vision, the prolific reproduction of the opusculum is easily explained. Architects, patrons, enthusiasts of machine design all wanted a copy of Francesco's fantastic manuscript. And here I show one example of kind of the copy of, or what's thought to be the copy of the opusculum in many different copy volumes, and yet another, and we can do this for almost every single one of the folios of the manuscript. This is more or less the narrative supported by the existing scholarship, which, following modern disciplinary contours, is split between the history of science and the history of art and architecture. And it's arguably in part due to this divide that the opusculum and the many related copies of the opusculum have been substantially misunderstood. And just to kind of give you a sense of the historiography of the last half century or so, we can cite, to begin with, perhaps the poignant article of the historian of science, Ladislo Reti, who claimed that Francesco di Giorgio's legacy as a machine designer was compromised by the numerous plagiarists who stole his drawings. Francesco Paolo Fiore, foremost scholar of Francesco di Giorgio and his architecture, has considered Francesco's machine designs as an extension of his military architecture. For Fiore, who has not really studied the opusculum at length, but who has looked at it, the importance of this volume resides in a strong Vitruvian element, which he recognizes particularly in its dedication. In this, Fiore had set the tone for a prolonged scholarly debate regarding the chronology of Francesco's treatises and whether he had access to Vitruvius as a young artist in Siena or only later in Urbino. Fiore's somewhat cursory study of the opusculum was akin to what followed. In the surfeit of edited volumes and critical editions dedicated to Francesco di Giorgio in the early 1990s and 2000s, the opusculum is routinely cited, albeit always in a rather perfunctory manner. And I actually think the relative lack of attention given to the manuscript in these publications has something to do with the fact that the British Museum never lent it for display. Justina Scalia arguably completed the most substantial study of the manuscript to date. It appears as number 1 in her 1992 checklist, Francesco's manuscripts and their copies. And according to Scalia, it is the earliest set of Francesco de drawings in, quote, finished form. My interest in the manuscript was piqued by this laudatory, if not opaque, history. And in the course of my study of the document, which has really begun with my doctoral work, my opinions have considerably shifted. In regard to the proposed dating and provenance, I don't think I have anything significant to add. On the basis of the documentary record and what is known about Francesco's professional trajectory, it seems probable that the opusculum was executed in the mid-1470s. And the learned dedication, coupled with the inventories of the ducal library, do suggest that a manuscript was at some point held within Federico da Montefeltro's famed collection. Yet the opusculum itself and its drawings tell a very different story. Much can be gleaned from an examination of the book itself as a material document. The folios are of rough parchment, marred with countless erasures, stains, underdrawings, and marks of semi-mechanical transfer. The presence of red chalk throughout the manuscript appears to be the product of an offset method. And here, just one example, you can see kind of the offset lines, particularly evident in the trapezoidal frame, copy marks here, and under UV light. This is obviously not a professional photograph. You can kind of see further all the different erasures and kind of reiterations that this drawing, this folio has already undergone. Our tentative hypothesis is that many of the drawings of the opusculum were based on existing templates, which were recorded in red chalk in an offset process and then finalized with ink. In the course of this process, many lines were erased and the elements of the machines were changed. And I can show you more kind of non-professional images, which really bring to light the numerous erasures in the manuscript. So here in other, you can see kind of this, the gear mechanism has been significantly changed from the original composition to then what follows. Here and other kind of two folios, which, to the naked eye seem, obviously beautifully worked, but then under UV, you can see that he's really substantially reworking the gearing, the worm gear, which is actually probably a very significant development that he's working on, as well as here, the cart and gear shaft, as well as here, we can see an entire kind of detailed drawing that has been erased. Well, I could go on. Just pause here for a second with some new other kind of details of some underdrawings or transfers. But for my purposes of the talk today, the key point is that Francesco's autograph opusculum is perhaps not so authoritative. The British Museum opusculum was not a presentation manuscript. Rather, it seems quite certain that the Opusculum de Architectura, at least in its origins, was a workshop model book. And certainly, I think this really comes to light when you compare it with some of the other exquisite illuminated manuscripts that line the shelves of the Ducal Library or that are now held in the Vatican. The greater story of this perplexing manuscript is necessarily the subject of a much larger contribution. And with Dr. Anna Rebecca Sartori, I'm currently working on a critical edition of the manuscript, which aims to elucidate its origins and the origins of the drawings, and to map out the paths of the manuscript's reproduction. And just to give you a sense of this, I present here our tentative stema, which considers only the manuscripts completed prior to 1600. We have to stop at some point. In my talk today, or at least in the time that remains, I want to narrow in on one aspect of this greater web, arguably the most complicated, that pertain to a set of closely related model books produced before or around the same time as the Opusculum. With this, I call attention to two volumes, the additional 34113 and the Palatino 767, both in which in turn lead us back to the work of Mariano di Jacopo Taccola. Taccola is the definitive figure in this history, and in a certain light, the story of the additional and the Palatino, and also the Opusculum, can be told as the story of Taccola's legacy. And this is something that I'm continually confronting and trying to balance. We're talking about Francesco, not Taccola, but yet Taccola is kind of present. In what follows, I hope to draw out some nuances apparent in the drawing books of Taccola and those of his followers, which are illuminating in regards to the copying practices of 15th century architects. For better or worse, there's not yet a single grand conclusion, but a series of vignettes or insights that delineate the ubiquity of copy drawing and the circulation of drawings and the prolonged life of workshop model books. Much like the Opusculum, the Sienese drawing books should be understood as compilations, not preconceived works. Most likely, they originated as stacks of unbound folios and for a significant period of time remained open to reference and annotation among a community of practitioners. The vibrant workshop culture of mid-15th century provides the context for these books and the collective practices of their making. As Samuel Edgerton once commented, 15th century Siena was a breeding ground for the nascent engineering profession. Employed by the commune's large landholding institutions, technically versatile design practitioners took on a host of tasks within the city and its greater rural contado. Projects involving construction, infrastructure development and maintenance, hydraulic works, mining activities, and the operation of naval ports. Although the work demanded a high degree of manual and technical skill, it also relied on practical mathematics, mechanics, and design. In this realm, and by way of direct connection between the studio or the University of Siena and the Spedale di Santa Maria della Scala, there was fostered a deep reverence for the work of Mariano di Jacopo Tacolo. And since he's not not yet of the stature of Michelangelo or Beef Brackdown, Tacolo was born in the late 14th century. He was trained and practiced as a woodworker throughout his career. And intriguingly, he also trained as a notary. Twice he was admitted to the Council of Judges and Notaries in Siena, and twice he was removed because he failed to fill all the prescriptions of the title. But it seems that this background enabled him to take up the position as treasurer of the Casa di Sapienza, which was part of the city's university. And he filled this role for at least a decade. As underscored by James Beck, throughout his lifetime, Tacolo maintained numerous important relationships. He was closely connected with Jacopo della Quercia, Domenico di Bartoli, and Brunelleschi. He also spoke with the city's leading humanists and scholars, and was of sufficient rank to offer his services to the Emperor Sigismund in 1432, with the dedication of one portion of his treatise, De Ingeniis. And here are images of that manuscript here, which for simplicity's sake, we can also just call the Florence Tacolo. So this is the vellum cover where we can see this profile portrait of Sigismund in Tacolo's hand, as well as on the one verso of within the manuscript, you see this portrait of the emperor symbolically holding the Florentine lion by the tail of his foot. And if we at least scan through a few folios of the manuscript, you can see what the typical layout is, with the machine drawing on the right, and then the explanatory text in Latin, with usually a little figure or animal vignette on the left facing page. And I will return to this book later in the talk. But the corpus of Tacolo extends far beyond this Florentine manuscript. In Munich, there exists another Tacolo volume, about 4 times as thick as the Florence manuscript, with exponentially more drawings. Traditionally, this has been seen as comprising the remaining books of De Ingeniis, the part that was not dedicated to Sigismund, which over time devolved into a sketchbook of designs, fantasies, and postals. And here's another folio of that. To add to this, there is yet another surviving Tacolo autographed manuscript, De Machinis. Although arguably less vibrant than the De Ingeniis, here especially so because it's in grayscale, the De Machinis commands respect in the degree to which it was cohesively reproduced. And this is something that I've only really come to accept quite recently. We know that within the course of the 15th century, numerous copies were made of this manuscript. There survive 4 15th century copies of De Machinis, and there's strong evidence that at least 2 of these stem from a lost exemplar. In returning then to the huge volume of Tacolo material, in light of the opusculum and the related copy volumes, a few key points should be made. To begin, most generally, the copy and circulation of Tacolo's manuscripts was by no means insignificant. Bernard Degenhardt and Annegret Schmidt have speculated that there was a unified edition of his De Ingeniis, but based on the work that I have done on the copy manuscripts after Tacolo, including the replication of the text and the images, translated from Latin into Italian, it seems clear that there were many more copies of Tacolo-based material in circulation. This suggests not only the artist's notable ambition, but also the considerable demand for his ideas, which is again complicated by, I think, this dialogue between the historians of science and the historians of art. You go back and forth between the idea that he's this crazy, fantasy, lives in a fantasy world, or that his designs actually have mechanical merit. So particularly I think remarkable of the weight of Tacolo's work are 2 copies of the De Machinis, the first in Paris, which is really just exceptional in its degree of refinement and finish, fully eliminated on refined parchment. Also, the fact that this manuscript spent its early life in Constantinople is remarkable, kind of speaking of the dissemination of this material on a larger scale. And also a volume now in Venice, which was composed about 20 years after Toccola's death, and also therefore speaks to the continuing relevance of his ideas. But what is further intriguing here is that even later, around 1520, an anonymous Paduan artist added marginal drawings and notes to the manuscript. And I owe this insight to Davide Gambino, who has the paleographic and linguistic skills to distinguish kind of or narrow down that specific moment when the text was recorded. But you can see throughout the manuscript, there's been these additions made to the Toccola material. And what's further kind of intriguing is that many of these additions are, again, those Francesco di Giorgio quote unquote drawings. So there's really the sense that decades after the fact, there is this implicit connection being made between the Toccola ancestry of the machine drawings and those that follow in the quote unquote Francesco di Giorgio tradition. Further insights into Toccola's corpus are gained from the additional and the Palatino 767, both of unknown authorship. The additional here on the left in the British Library is a hefty volume containing 261 folios and literally thousands of machine drawings. Well known, yet never rigorously studied, its drawings are commonly classified as after Toccola or after Francesco di Giorgio. The Palatino 767, composed of 132 parchment folios, is in many respects more amateurish. It has been studied as a confluence of the design ideas of Toccola and Francesco di Giorgio. On the basis of my study of both of these volumes, which is ongoing, I would suggest that neither book copies from the Opusculum, and their relationship to Toccola is close, but not direct. And again, this points to the existence of many more copied volumes. Here, just a comparison of the additional and Palatino volumes at the top of the folio with the Toccola exempla at the bottom. What the model would be at the bottom. In terms of an analytical method, I think what's really fundamental and what distinguishes my work from previous studies is the comparative approach that considers multiple different copies of the same drawing. So not just 2, but 4, 5, 12, 30 of the same kind of drawing copied. Equally important is the study of each volume in its entirety, looking at the sequence of drawings the composition requires, alternations of the drawing style, and media. In this, we not only gain insight into the copying process, but come to better understand the books as compilations, as opposed to preconceived works, where the history of art and the history of the book conditions us to speak of single authorship. Most likely these volumes originated, again, as unbound stacks of folios, and quite conceivably, for a period of time, they remained open to reference and annotation among a community of practitioners. In order to try to demonstrate this, we can start with a series of folios from the Florence Toccola manuscript that's supposedly dedicated to Sigismund. So here we can begin. Upon first view, the drawings appear relatively finished and complete. The idea that these were models for the additional and Palatino volumes seems reasonable. We can see here how the additional author removed the animal figures and the figural details along with the text and condensed the drawings on the facing pages. So he basically removed the text and just kind of merged the material. In the Palatino, we can see how the animal motif was retained, but the text removed and all visual information condensed on a single page. This pattern remains much the same for these two folios as well, with the chain pump and water well with tread wheel. So we see them in the Toccola at the top, at the base on the left, with the additional kind of condensing the two each on one page with the text. And this is a very close Italian translation of Tocqueville's Latin. And then the Palatino likewise kind of condensing those two with the relative animal motif on a single page, but without the text. Or here, another example. For the additional, the pattern remains, as we can see here, more or less. But in this case, the copying becomes less straightforward with the Palatino. It seems that the Palatino splices together the two compositions. So we see here, the copy is taking from this folio and this folio, and putting them together. And my first thought regarding this was that it was the result of the binding, something had been cut, but unfortunately, this is not the case. If you look at the quire structure, the two folios that kind of fit together in the Palatino that would copy from the Toccola are in two different quires. And what is more, the parchment is not the same piece of paper. The one is on the flesh side and the other one is on the skin side. So this is two different drawings from two different places. I don't know why they're like that. But it kind of gives you a sense of kind of this copying being more complex. It's not just this direct process. And if we continue to go through the Palatino, which is quite an odd book, more oddities come to light. Here we can see on the right, the copyist drawing something or copying something from Toccola, notably then on the left with something added by another hand in a different ink. Similarly here, we see Toccola copies, but then in the center of the folio on the right, a drawing that's been added conceivably by a later hand in a different ink, that being the aqueduct. There are also fountain designs and figural drawings in the Palatino that are quite distinct and seem to derive from other sources. On the basis of our current study, we can identify at least 3 different hands in the Palatino manuscript, and I would say this is clearly a workshop book. There are also drawings that have been traditionally considered to be after the opusculum. So if we take these Palatino drawings, this is, what Scalia and others will put up and say this is a definitive Francesco da Giorgio copy material. And we can see that there are kind of very close relationships with the opusculum. But if we kind of try to dissect these a little further, we can see that no model is ever exact. These are never exactly direct copies. There are not only significant details or differences, I would say, in the proportioning in the sense of perspective, but also in the attention to details and the real mechanics. And the hypothesis that both Francesco and the Palatino were looking at the same models is supported by the erasures and significant modifications we can see in the opusculum. So again, I don't think one is copying from the other, but that they're both looking to the same or to a similar source. So in this example, which we've seen before, we can see how Francesco changed the gearing system. He replaces the hand crank and horizontal lantern pinion with a vertical pinion, which would be powered by a Caspin bar, and it is retained in the Palatino model. If we see that, so this element here, which was rendered by Francesco and then erased in the final composition and replaced with this gearing system or this power mechanism. And in other instances, we see how Francesco first rendered the little cart beneath the column, which was undoubtedly part of the original model and was also copied by the Palatino copyists. But then he saw it unfitting and erased it. And you can see with the UV that it's erased. There are multiple kind of examples that I could cite here. And again, I think these are strong evidence that they were looking to a common source, but were not copying from one another. This web of exchange and copying is further developed through an examination of the blank folios of the Palatino. The manuscript contains 51 blank folios, or 102 blank pages, almost 40% of its total folios, which is remarkable for a workshop model book on parchment. You would think that this would be filled with more drawings. And looking more closely at these folios, and further scientific imaging is pending, maybe next week, it seems that in many instances, entire compositions completed with pen, ink, and wash were erased from the Palatino book. And many of these erased drawings appear to be fully rendered compositions copied from Takala. So again, it would be great if I could get a better image of this. This is the best we could do. We see here from the naked eye, it doesn't appear like anything, but actually you can see that there's this composition entirely erased, which appears to have been a copy of what is the Florence 7V, entirely erased from the Takala. Or here yet another example, now just a blank folio, but in fact, you know, an erased composition very similar to this one here. So we could suggest that perhaps the Palatino 767 was in its origins a complete copy of Takala, which was then kind of partially erased and reused. And maybe there was a sense that some of the drawings were dated and had to be updated. Obviously, we can never really know what happened, but it's a great example of kind of the continual use and modification of the designs over time. What I think is clear is that this kind of modern idea of the authorial designer and the authorial design has no place in this type of a book. If we then circle back to the additional, which we have seen closely follow Takala's models, we can gain further insight into another facet of early modern copying. Looking at the concordances between the drawings of the additional and those of Takala's manuscripts, some patterns emerge. And I spare you, this is about a 20-page Word document. I'm giving you just 2 pages. But as we can see here, at least kind of at the start of the additional, the first pages are text, which is copied after Takala. You can see kind of a relatively clear order of the additional author copying from the Florence Takala, even in a remarkably systematic order. I mean, it's not exact, but it's like 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a fairly clean kind of sequence of numbers that's going down. So it seems that it's a relatively straightforward copying process. But where then the material of the Florence Takala runs out, the book ends, the additional author picks up with the material that's now in the Munich volume. And what I found striking in working this out, and often each folio is delineated by, numerous drawings, so it goes down sometimes to D or E per folio. The pattern is much more sporadic. He's not just copying a single folio one to one. It's kind of this maddening piecemeal process. And so to give you a sense of identifying the comparisons in this section of the additional with the Munich Takala is quite time-consuming and difficult because both books are very dense with drawings and the copying does not follow a linear model. It's literally kind of piecing together, as I said, various drawings and trying to match each mechanical model with the additional within a specific Takala prototype. And I'm not there yet, but I'm relatively confident that we probably have about an 80–90% match. I think kind of the greater conclusion here is that there's a clear shift in the copying pattern of the additional from a very linear, systematic process to one that's more jumbled. And this prompted me then to reconsider what was thought to be the model, namely the Munich Takala. Why would all of a sudden the copyist start doing this kind of jumbled copying when he was at first just copying in a very routine manner? Maybe he's not actually copying what we think he's copying. So we return to this Munich book, which is really a true sketchbook. It's a fantastic manuscript, which makes it so fascinating. And even in the reproduction here, you can see kind of the many editions, how Takala has returned to this on multiple occasions, different inks, different almost manners. Some of the drawings are very quick. He he has kind of a different technique. This is probably over a 20-year period. And multiple scholars, including myself, have noted the numerous check marks in the drawings, which are kind of a mark of the copying process, someone literally checking off with copy to transferring to someone else. And it's always been thought that these are individuals copying from Takala, and that might well be, but it could also be Takala copying from himself, transferring kind of the designs in his Zibaldone to another more ordered book. Once this kind of veil of authority is lifted, we can start to kind of consider what was the autograph might be itself a copy, or that there might have been multiple autographs from which copies were made. We start to kind of open ourselves up to a new spectrum of questions about copying. So again, I would suspect that probably there was another Takla made after this that was more systematic, and perhaps that provided the model for which the additional copied, which is why there would have been a pattern that was made more sense, plausibly. During a recent visit to Florence, I had the opportunity to sit again with Takala's Florence manuscript, the book that was supposedly prepared to be dedicated to the emperor. And it had been probably about 15 years since I saw this in the flesh. And I expected to be quite moved by this more formal work, but what actually struck me was the relatively incomplete nature of so many of the machine drawings. And if we go back to this drawing, we can see that the horizontal beam is literally floating in space. It just ends. It seems that the drawing is artificially cut, that there was an existing frame and it didn't quite fit the new paper format. Or here, where the landscape just kind of ends, about maybe 4 centimeters from the edge of the page. An artist who was drawing freehand would not render a composition in this way. Or here, where we can see even kind of the underdrawing of the top of this post is still substantially incomplete. And there are examples of this throughout this book. Could it be that Takala's Florence volume, which was supposedly so diligently studied by his followers, was itself a copy? Or dare we ask it, was Takala himself a copyist, appropriating drawings that had been laid out by others? These questions are not simply answered and probably cannot be answered. But in considering the origin of Francesco di Giorgio's opuscolo, the drawings of which are not quite as original as Francesco claims them to be, the web of copies executed by his Sienese peers offers insight into what was then routine practice. In respect to larger discussions of originality and authorship, this body of material is a prime example of the collective processes of early modern design. Not only were there many hands involved in artistic production, but the work of art, in this case a model book, is itself part of a longer continuum of practice. Copying was not considered a weakness or the result of a creative lapse. It was something that was productive. It was an implicit means of confirming the value and the relevance of the art, and here kind of in the Latin sense of the term, as a skill, a craft, something that could be taught and honed in practice. One might say that even in the early modern workshop, copying was at least part of the product of a very human desire to establish one's relevance or even their existence within a longer chronology. The copying that I have studied in machine drawings from workshop books or folios stacked together very much speaks to the long life of drawings as passed down through generations. So whereas historians may want to name names and give precise dates, the material itself shows use and additions over decades, if not centuries. And I don't think this is to say that there were no great artists or no great hands, but that the creation was part of this longer kind of ongoing dialogue or process. So we can't perhaps say that it ended in 1500. Really, the book kind of lives on, has a life for other users. And in order to speak of such drawings and such books effectively, I think we need to really reconsider kind of the language that we've come to assume that is so heavily based on authorship and originality, and really kind of open it up to look at these things more broadly. So thank you.